Hi there. Sheldon is typing, and I can hear him. But this is Free Association / Liberty.me.
My hands up.
Liberty.me live.
Don't shoot. Hands up. Don't shoot.
I make a big to-do out of this, and then I loudly crack my my knuckles. So I'll just sit quietly now. I'm Lucy Steigerwald, as you well know. That's Sheldon Richman, as you probably extra well know. You know us from various websites and publications over the years. Me for a few years, he for lots more years. You know. Look us up if you don't know. That's not what we're here about. We're here about, what are we here to talk about today? Sheldon.
Oh, you're asking me?
Well, I haven't written anything about this yet. I'm the only human being
well,
who's not written about Oregon yet.
It's the events in Harney County, Oregon, Burns, Oregon, that kind of pushed things to this kind of general discussion of government standoffs. It might not have been the best title, because I don't know that we'll talk about government standoffs, but confrontations between people and the government over various issues. But we'll begin with this one and related ones. So I worked today to write an article on this, and since I was writing only something op-ed length, which means 700, 800 words, I tried to narrowly focus it, so I didn't deal with a lot of issues that could be dealt with. But the main one I dealt with was that some people, especially on the progressive side of things, the non-libertarian left, let's say, are calling these guys, and the Hammonds, they're calling them terrorists. The Hammonds, for people who aren't keeping up, are these two people, a father and son, a 72-year-old father, I think a 48-year-old son, who are ranchers in rural Oregon. And in 2001 and 2006, they set fires, controlled fires on their property. One, at least their version of things is, one was to kill somewhat juniper trees, which are like an invasive growth that hurt the grass and make it hard for the cattle to graze. And the second one in 2006 was because there was a wildfire on adjacent federal land, government land, and they set a fire as a break, which I guess is an accepted procedure. But it's alleged that they didn't tell authorities they were going to do it, which maybe under the law they're supposed to do. They actually do, I think they dispute that. They put out the first fire, even though it was burning like over 100 acres of government land fire. They put that out. Nobody was hurt. And the fire accidentally jumped onto the adjacent federal land. It wasn't that they set the fire on the federal land. They were burning on their property for reasons that are regarded as accepted reasons. In the second case, I guess firefighters put it out. There were firefighters already there on the federal land to put out the wildfire. So the fire that they set then jumped into the federal land, which I guess potentially endangered the firefighters, and it was put out. So they got charged for this. And they got charged under the 1996, what is it called, Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. Now this was, a quick background here, this was a bill sponsored by Republicans in the House and Senate and signed by the great triangulation president, Bill Clinton, who was up for re-election that year, right? He signs it in April of 1996. He's running for re-election, and he was the great triangulator, right? Steal issues from conservatives by doing certain things, namely like signing a bill like this, although he might have perfectly believed in the bill anyway, apart from his... And it did things like limit the right of habeas corpus and one of these bad things. Now, it came in the wake of the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. There was a bombing, as you recall, or you read about, and the 1995 attack or bombing of the Murrah building in Oklahoma City, the federal building. So, you know, as usual, government grabs power when it looks like there's a crisis. And so they got charged under this. So my question was, why did they get, and other people have asked this, why did they get charged under a anti-terrorism law? It wasn't terrorism. Terrorism is an inherently political term, by the way. And if you look at my piece at Free Association, you can read Glenn Greenwald's defense of that proposition, that it's an inherently political term. But if it could have any reasonable meaning, it seems to me it means killing, injuring, or destroying the property of innocent people, non-combatants, for some political purpose. In other words, to terrorize, which is why we call it terror or terrorism. Well, the Hammonds didn't terrorize anybody. They didn't intend to, first of all, and they didn't even do it unintentionally. So that seems ridiculous. Why was it? And it's just like the old RICO statute, which was set up to go after organized crime, was later used against all kinds of people it wasn't even intended to be used for. So there's always that danger. Now, the people who are occupying this building, which now call themselves Citizens for Constitutional Freedom, the name they came up with because people were demanding to know what they're called. They actually just made it up on the spot. They admit that. They said, okay, we need a name, all right. They're occupying this building. It was an unoccupied, Fish and Wildlife Services building that was the headquarters on this refuge, this wildlife refuge in Harney County. And so these guys, I don't know how many of them, I think there's some women too, some of them armed, occupied this place, and they're still there in this building. There are no cops on the scene, there are no feds on the scene. There's a lot of media on the scene, apparently. People can come and go. They haven't shut down the area. And so that's how it stands. But those people are being called by the progressives terrorists, white terrorists. Their group has been dubbed Yol-Qaeda, Yol as in Seol, Yol-Qaeda, and Vanilla ISIS.
Good puns. I mean, good puns.
Very glib, but if you go on Twitter and other places, you'll find this stuff. And people are saying, it's because they're white, the government's not doing anything. If they're black, they'd be killed by now. I'm not taking their side. There's objectionable things, which we'll get into, about these guys, and I have some objections, but I don't want to make this opening statement take up the whole time. But it's not terrorism. This is the narrow point I want to make. It's not terrorism. They haven't terrorized anybody, hurt anybody. Well, the closest town's 35 miles away. So I'm just objecting to this this promiscuous use of this already politically loaded term. And so that was really the point of my piece. But there's a lot else to talk about. You've read some stuff that I haven't had a chance to read, Lucy. So let's get underway here.
Well, I was kind of going to steal your general premise for my anti-war piece, and the Greenwald premise that he's argued so well over the years, that terrorism is just this dreadful term. And I still think, I mean, some of the Earth First Animal Liberation Front people in the 90s and more recently have been charged. I don't know if it's under that exact law, but even they, perhaps one could argue, are closer to terrorists because they purposefully have destroyed property. And they're still not terrorists in my book. And they've still gotten, 20-year sentences. I think they're goofy and I think they're dangerous sometimes. But, this stuff creeps into other stuff where it doesn't belong because it's terrorism. Right. I don't know. In spite of my approval of the quality pun use with Yal-Qaeda and such, there's a couple of good ones. There's a whole list. I find the liberals, I won't even say the left, to be truly embarrassing on this because they just, they're exactly like Republicans in the sense that all they want here is to score political points. And the only way to describe some of the reaction is hysteria. It's actually it's hysteria, and it's what I think is the most mainstream liberal thing ever, which is the people who are dying for bloodshed of white people to make things fair and equal. I hate to sound like a Republican stereotyping liberals in this way, but truly mainstream liberals do really come across this way, and they're coming across this way right now in respect to this event, is they really seem like they want white people to die so police are more equal and fair. That is a solution that they think is superior to the current, racially biased type of police force. It's like people who say, well, darn it, let's draft women because the draft is terrible. I can find a better solution than that. Would you like to hear it? It's stop the bad thing. Don't make the bad thing equal. It's really awful. And as usual, you know, the really lefties are in many cases being much more principled on this. Not even left libertarians, but people like a Jacobin magazine and like real commie-ish people that make my, you know, that I really dislike a lot of the time. They're the type of people who manage to remember things like Waco a little more clearly, and who know that they don't want to see that happen again, even to people who are less sympathetic than, you know, their allies. I don't know. There's a lot of avenues there. One of the interesting things that I read was by Connor Friedersdorf in The Atlantic, who's my favorite Atlantic guy. And I can never quite pin down his politics. I think I would perhaps say he's a libertarian sympathetic liberal, or a liberal leaning sort of minarchist libertarian. Some people don't like him because they think he's kind of a softy on things, but I like his angles because I think that he really tries to gently point out partisan hypocrisies and double standards sometimes from what is clearly sort of a principled perspective. And he is surprisingly in favor of these fellows, or rather in favor of, you know, not being hysterical, not calling for bloodshed, and also saying, well, they may have a point with the mandatory minimums that they got sentenced under,
yeah, right.
which was a 5-year thing. And Ken White, another libertarian-ish type, he does his law blog at Pope Hat, was pointing out that the mandatory minimum situation that happened to the Hammonds, the father and son, is not unique. People have gotten, you know, they were going to get 5 years. People have gotten much worse charges for arguably even lesser, you know, crimes. So, you know, just as sort of a law explainer, he says it's not, you know, it's not a unique situation, and it could have been worse in terms of sentencing, which is fine. That's useful, practical advice. But Friedersdorf is making a great point, which is, why can't people come together and say, they are, you know, these dudes are doing this thing that makes me uncomfortable, you know, their tactics make me uncomfortable, but why can't people say, gee, mandatory minimums? They're trying to, you know, protest this thing. 5 years in prison is a bit excessive. According to his piece, it says the fire caused less than $1,000 in damage. I mean, I don't know if they paid, you know, they paid that money or what have you.
I thought they paid a $40,000 fine already, or at least they were fined. So that's separate from prison, right?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's another one of those things. It's just, you know, one of the millions of instances where you have committed a crime against the state. You know, it's not that you've damaged wildlife or endangered people. It's that you have to, you know, paying it back or some kind of restitution isn't satisfactory. You have to go to jail.
Right. It wasn't, even if you believe in jail as a general principle, there wasn't malice. Now there's some allegation that the second fire was burned to cover up poaching.
Right.
But I don't know if that's true. But even if it was true, there wasn't a fire really for malicious purposes to harm somebody. And they're not a continuing threat.
Right.
You know, so I don't see any grounds, no matter what your position is on jailing and, you know, prison in general. I don't see that.
I understand that some things are negligent, but I'm very uncomfortable with the vindictive sort of punishing people for what could have happened. And this happens with mandatory minimums with firearms as well. You have these cases where someone, perhaps ill-advisedly, you know, like the woman in Florida who said she fired a shot into the wall, and she says because she was afraid of her abusive husband or partner, and she was in danger of 20 to 60 years in prison for that. And like every firearm expert says, you know, you don't fire that thing unless you're okay with killing somebody. There's no such thing as a warning shot, etc. That's fine. You can say all that without thinking that 20, much less 60 years is a remotely reasonable punishment. There is this, you know, inflation about sentencing where we act like all of these enormous times in prison are just minor. I mean, 5 years doesn't sound like much because of people like that woman, I'm blanking on her name, of course, in Florida. I mean, because there are these even more horrific stories. 5 years in prison for these negligent rednecks doesn't sound like anything. Well, it is something. I mean, 5 years is a long time.
Well, sure. And, there's so many other aspects. You touched on a lot of them, the things I was going to mention. There are people, again, on the liberal side of things, quote, liberal side of things, who want the government to move in, like Waco style, and wipe them out. I forget the phrase that's used, something like wipe them out. There's been some real, horrible thoughts directed at these people, considering what they've done and what they have not done, and that's pretty appalling. That they're bloodthirsty. The people now saying those sorts of things are the first to condemn the right, the conservatives, for this, and then they join in when they don't like the people on the other side.
I mean, I think part of it is this terror of rednecks with guns. And someone on Facebook, I think, pointed out, well, this is the kind of dude who's always armed. It would be weird if they weren't carrying a weapon, like odds are. And I think it also speaks to this complete culture uncomfortableness with rednecks with guns. The way that the worst conservatives are terrified of black kids in hoodies, and tend to think that whatever they do, especially if they've ever done something bad in their life, they deserve what they're going to get. It's the same thing.
Yeah, it's classism.
Doing it today.
It's classism. Yeah, that's right. And the idea that you should even things up for police brutality against blacks and by slaughtering a bunch of whites. Yeah, I mean, does that even require any comment? I mean, that's just idiotic.
It is, and it's complete. It's point scoring. It's, well, how do you like it? And it just makes you look awful when you make that argument. And a lot of reputable people are making that argument, and a sampling of Facebook liberals that I've seen as well. On a side note, this goes back to the fire thing, but I do want to rant slightly over the fact that the government is often atrocious, well, both at land management and at fire management. And they spent, 80 years mismanaging Yellowstone and putting out the small fires that basically start spontaneously, start from lightning, which burn off some of the flammable undergrowth and stuff. For years, they put them out, and then in the early 80s, they had this massive fire that burned a third of the park because they had been doing something wrong. They also, messed up with the carnivores, and then there were too many elk, and the elk ate too many plants. It's government, It seems pretty banal, but that's why the ending of Parks and Recreation is not satisfying. Even government they're bad at this even, and they're bad at fire management. It's just another thing they're bad at.
Yeah, so that opens up the land issue. Obviously, the federal government, the national government, central government controls an awful lot of land, especially out west. It's amazing when you look at the map. Justin Raimondo's column this week, which came out yesterday, on this issue, has that map of how much land, the surface and I guess subsurface stuff is controlled by the federal government. And if you look at Nevada and Oregon and California, it's unbelievable how much is red. In other words, controlled by you can't imagine. I mean, there's hardly any non-government land in Nevada, for example, where the 2014 Bundy controversy occurred. And of course, there's a connection to this because Cliven Bundy's son is one of the people at the Fish and Wildlife facility there that's occupied, and he's been doing some speaking on behalf of the Hammonds. Although the Hammonds have somewhat distanced themselves from these guys. I mean, they're, I wanted to say something about mandatory minimums. That's what I wanted to say since you brought that up. There's a strong body of opinion against the idea of a mandatory minimum at all. The idea that you remove all discretion from a judge and not let the judge look at individual circumstances is objected to. There's a great organization called Family Against Mandatory Minimums, FAM, F-A-M-M, which is run by an old friend of mine from years ago, Julie Stewart. She's been at this a very long time. I think she started it because they use mandatory minimums in outright victimless crimes like
Her brother,
drugs.
wasn't it her
Yeah,
brother who went to
I think
jail?
her brother was convicted, yes, and that's what motivated her. I knew her when we both worked at the Cato Institute, and she left Cato to start this group, and she's still running it now. And this was the early 1990s, so
Things must have been
she's
much
been,
bleaker for her back then. I
she's
mean,
been at it for a while. That's right. And I think her chief concern back then, at least, was, there was victimless drug offenses, things like that. But now we can see that it's used in other things as well. The Hammonds were originally sentenced to something less than the 5-year mandatory. It was like a year, I think it was. Plus, they had this hefty fine. The federal government then went and appealed and said, "No, wait a second, that's below the mandatory. They got to get more."
right.
And I think another judge, I don't think it was the original judge, I'm not quite sure about that, but I think it was, gave them the 5. And so they only recently, after the first of the year, turned themselves in. That's when this takeover occurred.
And the Pope hat thing I mentioned before does the law explainer thing. I should link to that. He mentions that, like, based on, lawyerly precedent, the challenge based on the 8th Amendment, based on cruel and unusual punishment, was rejected, and the mandatory minimum was upheld, basically on the disturbing grounds that people have gotten bigger sentences for worse things, and that was upheld, like that was allowed. So this is allowed as well. And based on precedent, he says, like, you may not like this, but this sort of holds up. It's kind of disheartening because it's just sort of a confirmation that that's how it works, and that challenges based on prison length and cruel and unusual punishment, I guess, haven't really gotten anywhere, sadly.
Right. So I was saying this takes us now into the land question, because the people holding the government building they're not just acting on behalf of the Hammonds or in solidarity with the Hammonds. They're saying the government's holding of the land violates not only their rights, but the rights of the sovereign state of Oregon. So they're not exactly libertarians. The Bundys have defended government subsidies to ranchers. Ranchers gets grazing subsidies, but at the same time, in some places, I guess the Bureau of Land Management or whoever's in charge can arbitrarily say, okay, no more grazing in this land, and it catches the ranchers short, I guess. So it's a combination of they're getting subsidies, they're getting a bargain in terms of grazing rights, but on the other hand, they're also subject to arbitrary whim of the bureaucrats who can change the rules. So the son, Emin, you there, Lucy? The son defending government subsidies, saying, I'm not saying there's not a role for government. He's saying there's a role for government. So there's that issue.
We gotta keep the minarchists. I mean, I always think maybe there's a little hope, but some of those dudes have some bad history of being ridiculous.
And then but they're also advocates of states' rights against the federal government. So I guess you could say they're good federalists. And they call them, but their views on the Constitution seem to confuse me a little bit because, I guess there's nothing in the Constitution about managing any land for the federal government except the District of Columbia. However, that was kind of wiped away when Jefferson, the great limited government advocate, bought Louisiana. Well, actually, it's much more than the state of Louisiana from Napoleon, and he knew it was unconstitutional. He really
wanted that land. It just looked so good. He couldn't help
himself. Considered introducing a constitutional amendment and then said, what the hell, let's just go ahead and do it. Let's not go to the trouble. So that was a long time ago. That was, 1800 what, exactly? So that horse has left the barn, so to speak. Now, there's another issue, which the Bundys, in their case in 2014, I think were also vulnerable to. If the land is going to be taken away from the national government, which I fervently hope it is, it shouldn't go to these ranchers or even the state of Oregon. There's an Indian tribe known as the Northern Paiute who have the best claim to that land. They were basically thrown off it, but beginning with Ulysses S. Grant, and stuck on reservations and otherwise starved and killed and and removed. And they still maintain a claim to that land as supposedly being held in trust by the federal government. You know what that means.
Yeah.
They're the claimants. And see, here's an easy case, and I made this point over the Bundy matter almost 2 years ago. The idea of rectification when you have land theft that's very old is a tough issue for libertarians, right? Where the victims of the theft are gone, where the original perpetrators are gone, and so generations have passed, and it's built up. Maybe it's a big city now. Does libertarian principle say no? You got to level it, or at least give it back, kick everybody out, and give it back to the heirs, many generations, right? Hence,
right, yeah.
Okay, that's a tough issue. But in this case, and in the Bundy case, and in lots of cases in the West, it's unoccupied land. It's open land. The government may have a few buildings, but who cares if they knock down government buildings and give it back to the Indians? This is easy for libertarians.
Amen.
And yet it's not talked about very much. So it's an opportunity for us to remind the public how the Indians were treated. I mean, it was horrendous. By the way, I watched a movie. It was an HBO movie called, based on Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I highly recommend it. Look it up if you can. It's very good. It's bleak, but very good. But here's an easy case. So we can revive this issue and say, here's at least some small way these crimes can be rectified, because you're not even inconveniencing, urban dwellers now who are
you don't have to move a couple million people off of
right. It's a low cost way to to have some rectification for at least one Indian tribe.
Yeah, I haven't read up on my homesteading and my land stuff, and I've been meaning to for a while now, because I think I need a little more background in that. But I do. I mean, we forget all about this. My mom actually is from Montana, so she grew up around more natives and close to a reservation. But I'm in the East and have been most of the time, and I don't know. I feel like, not to piss off anyone, but we at least remember how shoddily blacks were treated and are treated, and we still sort of bring that up. But natives basically aren't even worth, discussing most of the time, because the U.S. managed to kill most of them, and the rest of them have been neatly tucked aside. So.
And that was the first, look, that was the early American imperialism. I mean, America's leaders were empire builders from day one, actually before day one, before the Revolution.
Yeah.
Franklin had a plan that he proposed to the British, that there be a partnership to establish an empire, throughout the Western Hemisphere, and certainly the North America, if not getting into the South. The Brits turned him down. So then he turned independence. So it was, they had empire. They were of an empire state of mind from the first, and the first nations to be conquered were the Indian nations. They were going to be removed, and there were two wings. You had the dovish wing that said, well, let's try to assimilate them into American life by force, of course. And then you had, so that was those were the doves. The hawks said, no, you'll never do that. Let's just exterminate them. Those were the two contending parties. Some were a little more charitable, and so they went and they screwed them. They broke every treaty. They broke every agreement. They said, look, okay, we need you to move out of this land, but you're going to have this land. Except then next year or whenever, they went to them and said, okay, now we need that land. We're moving you somewhere else. So one thing after another. Terrible history.
My personal favorite summation of America is still when the Lakota Sioux lost the war, and the U.S. government said, all right, well, we'll let you keep the Black Hills in North Dakota at least. And then they said, soon afterwards, just kidding, we're going to take it, we're going to carve big fucking president heads in your sacred mountain. Yeah. America, that sums it up pretty well. It sums up government pretty well. Yeah. I'd say. It's pretty bad.
And the movie deals with the issues in Dakota, yes.
And I don't know, like, except for the 70s, which I wasn't around for, so I missed it, but like there was this blip of remembering to care about Native issues again, and like that seems to be the only time that really came up. And just I don't know, it's it's very upsetting to read about. I have an ancestor who was scalped by Sioux. I don't know if he deserved it or not, but.
By the way, the scalping was originated by the English.
Well, I know it was at least
not by the
perpetuated
Indians.
and spread. I thought somebody, like, I think it's important, like, the tribes, you know, like, some people get all gooey, hippie, like, they all just hug nature all day. And, like, the Comanche, for example, were pretty damn scary in terms of.
Yeah, you don't need to romanticize. I agree.
Yeah.
We shouldn't. And the movie I mentioned has a character pointing that out to one of the Indian leaders. So yeah, we need not idealize every Indian tribe. Some I'm sure were peaceful. The French got along pretty well with the Indians. That's why British were fighting the French and Indians. The French and Indian War was not the French versus the Indians. It was the British and the Americans against the French and Indians. So there's a history there that we ought to be aware of, because I think it puts, I don't want to sound like an American basher, but it puts that in perspective. And the people that want to say that everything went wrong with the Spanish-American War or the Progressive Era or World War I, just don't know what they're talking about.
I mean, those were all bad too, but yes.
But they were preceded by pretty bad stuff. Anybody that likes Andrew Jackson needs to do some reading.
Oh my God. I mean, I once watched a documentary about him, and he was kind of fascinating. And he married, sort of a scandalous woman, and he had like a party with a big wheel of cheese in the White House. And there are all these other details where you think, God, it's too bad you were so the worst. It went all, his life, and he got worse and worse as it went along, and it just got more and more.
Yeah, and I know some libertarians will say, but he vetoed the bank.
Oh, fuck off.
On the other hand, he slaughtered many, many Indians. Trail of Tears,
I would call a libertarian deal breaker.
He invaded Florida.
I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the Supreme Court actually said, no, this is ridiculous, the Trail of Tears. I think they were actually against it, if I recall correctly. And Jackson said, we'll just do this anyway. Someone should check on that. But
and when he was still a general under Monroe and Quincy Adams, who was Secretary of State, they winked at him so that he would invade Florida and, again, slaughtered a bunch of Indians and some other people.
Yeah. Strange.
Spanish.
Strange, bad man. Interesting, though, but bad.
I would say take him off the $10 bill, but then I remember that's a government bill, so I don't care who's on a government bill. Let them put monsters on a government bill.
The 20. But that is actually
the 20, sorry.
Response when people say somebody awesome like Harriet Tubman should be on the money. I'm like, that feels a little insulting. Like, I think she deserves a much better honor than that. I'm not sure what, but I mean,
I think we should put the worst butchers on all the government money. I'll launch a campaign for that.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there.
Kissinger. I put Kissinger on the 10.
Yeah, I think that's good. W got to hit.
Brzezinski, George Bush, the second.
Him and Cheney can share one of the bills. I'm not sure which one. Sigh. And to cap it off, it's not called Custer's Last Stand. It's called White People Got Killed, and these white people deserved it, or something catchier. But point still stands.
Yeah, and the movie shows very interestingly how Sitting Bull, who was, he was in the war, that battle that killed Custer, was made to pay dearly for that by being totally humiliated. Not that they killed him, but they eventually killed him. But he was killed by police, although they were they were Indian police. In other words, there were police that had been, they co-opted Indians and made them put him in the army, who then did patrols, and they ended up killing him. When they broke into his house, it looks like something you would see in Iraq. One of these nighttime raids. They burst into his house at night. But before all that, they totally humiliated him. The army, in front of the other Indians, made him out to be like, they had him stand in line. He was very well respected among Indians, and they thought of him as a leader. Mm-hmm. But the Americans wanted him knocked down to size, so they made him stand in line for his rations and all that stuff. It was just a little, how they, the trivial humiliations on top of the big crimes.
Yeah, I don't know as much about this history as I should, but everything I learn is just so appalling. There was a documentary series I cannot remember the name of that was basically the history of natives in America and part of homeschooling, being homeschooled by libertarians, and my mom knowing what was up. I remember watching it in my school days. And I would recommend it if I could remember what the hell it was called, but that's kind
Yeah.
of where I know this stuff.
The late Leonard Liggio, great libertarian, great historian, knew book as much as anybody, if not more, about history of all kinds. Wrote a paper in the Radical Review back in the 60s, I guess, which unfortunately is not online. Somebody needs to put it online. But where he points out that the model for how the Indians were treated, first by the English and then by the American the Americans who inherited the Indian problem, quote close quote. The model for how they treated them, the slaughter, the extermination, the removal, were how the English treated the Irish.
Oh.
And so it's a very well documented paper about that's the model they adopted, and they used to scalp the Irish. I mean, they were horrible to the Irish. The English were, yeah, oh yeah, terrible, and they regarded them as subhuman. Just
if you need any sign that race is like a social construct and even changes all the time, just read about that, because that's almost like it doesn't quite compute, because we're used to, there are jokes about drunkenness, but like being treated on that level by an imperial power, I don't think we think of that as being something white people suffer from. But then they weren't white back then, I guess. That was the point.
Well, that's a point that Thaddeus Russell makes in the Renegade History of the United States, the first couple of chapters on how immigrant groups were regarded when they first came. The Irish.
It's fascinating.
Polish.
The Italians.
The Jews, the Italians. They were regarded as blacks until they made it. Like when Irish started getting into government in Boston and New England and police and police commissioners and stuff like that. Then they left the ranks of blacks. I mean, it's amazing. There's a history I did not know, so I recommend that book. That's worth reading.
Me too. And I guess the Jews probably weren't officially white until, I don't know, the 50s or so. Certainly post World War II, even if they had made their strides in Hollywood earlier. But that's a very worthwhile book.
Definitely. So all this kind of connects, because there's a racism, but given what your point about the social construct aspect to it, there's classism, which I think you brought out with how the liberals are regarding these guys and there's women there too, I guess, in Oregon. It seems like lots of people are plagued by these kinds of issues. And can't get their head straight about it.
It's fair to criticize. I was looking at an Esquire piece by a guy that I don't really like his writing very much. It's very sort of authoritarian, mainstream, as far as I can tell. But he talks about three of the guys, and one of them is terrified of Sharia law, and one of them is sit around the border waiting, trying to catch Mexicans. And one of them, I don't know if it was one of the same ones or a different one, is clearly what they call a, oh my God, what do you call those people who now, of course, I'm blanking. They often look in trouble at like a traffic stop or something because they're totally about non-compliance. And I think once maybe one of these people has jumped a cop at a traffic stop. But I remember there was a case of them making, which I enjoyed this in particular, making the cops cut them out of their seatbelts because they basically refused to move. That I thought was great. But they have these weird conspiracy theories sort of about bureaucracy and like paperwork. God, I know what they're called. I know this. And now I'm I
don't know what you mean.
Blast it. Sovereign citizens, David. Thank you. I was totally blanking on that. Very odd birds. Certainly, they have some overlap to a point with libertarians and anarchists, but they have these odd ideas. And of course, you know, in this quote, this Esquire dude has about this guy, you know, there's all these bad qualities in the middle. It's like, and he also hates taxes, like as if that's some sort of moral failing, you know. He believes they're legal plunder.
Yeah, yeah.
Goodness. But basically, though, one of my points that I've been trying to raise before is that it doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters, you know, we should talk about it and note that these people are, you know, ridiculous in certain ways. Some of them seem a bit self-aggrandizing and or suicidal. It's hard to say, but a lot of liberals, vaguely at least, finally get that Waco and Ruby Ridge were bad things, you know? They may not really have the right idea, but at least they think, well, that, you know, maybe that was excessive, something tragic happened there. But if those were happening now, they would be hysterically calling them terrorists on, you know, on Twitter and stuff, because, you know, the Weavers and the Davidians had some terrible ideas. You know, one family was paranoid racists. One was a cult run by a probable child molester, and all of them fired and killed federal agents. And they're still victims, though. You know, they were still victims because of the way they were treated and they were aggressed upon. And you know, but these dudes haven't done anything as dramatic as killing a Fed or doing anything violent yet. And they're acting like they're calling them terrorists. Why can't we call them terrorists? You know, basically because people are being hysterical about Black Lives Matter type people. Well, we better get some of our own back and call these guys terrorists. But they haven't done anything yet. And just this you know, this dismissal of the complicated quality of some of these interactions between citizens and government, just, you know, I mean, I almost want to say, like, Waco, Davidians and the Weavers were worse, you know, they were aggressive and violent, but they were victims. So just hold on and being hysterical about these guys. I don't know. It's just,
good advice. One of the guys who's acted, I've seen at least interviewed on CNN, maybe he's acting as a spokesman, is John Ritzheimer, who has been involved in anti-Muslim activities. He either still does or had a website where you could buy T-shirts that say, you know, F Muslims. That kind of shows you where it's. He didn't say F. I'm keeping this clean for the kids in the audience there. Watch your language, kids. Stay in school. No, don't stay in school. Stay in home school. Stay in home school. So yeah, I don't embrace these guys. Right. I can pick out some statements that I would agree with, where they say the federal government should not control land. Yes, I can agree with them on that. But a lot of their affirmative views, probably most of their affirmative views, I would not agree with. So I don't say this out of sympathy for them per se, but for more like what you're saying, that they have not committed violence, they have not terrorized people, so they're not terrorists.
Right. They have a long way. I mean, there are all these, you know, there are differences. Both the Weavers and Davidians were defending their homes. These guys have left their homes to go somewhere else. Perhaps that's more aggressive. But again, haven't killed anyone yet. I mean, there's sort of I don't know. It's hysteria is the only word for it. And I also think there's this nasty war mentality, not just because they're calling for drone strikes or to Waco these guys, in some of the terms I've seen, but because there's just this, you know, this demonizing of people some of whom have very stupid views, but this assumption that they will never change, they will never wise up, they will never grow any more prudent or smart. This, you know, we might as well just wipe out these damn rednecks with guns, just like we might as well wipe out those black kids in hoodies who listen to music we hate and, you know, shoplifted once or they have sold weed once. Let's just wipe them out because they're not worth it. And it's the same on every side. It's the rednecks, it's hating the rednecks, and it's hating the blacks, and the blacks with the wrong clothing, you know, who talk the wrong way. And it's a horrible attitude, and it's incredibly prevalent, I'm sorry to say. And I don't know. They're not worth anything, basically, because right now, you know, they have bad ideas or they've done a bad thing in their life.
Agreed. No, I think it's the superior attitude toward people that, number one, like guns, that are rural, that are out west. Uh, it's culturist.
Hmm.
I don't know, that term's probably been used before. Classist might not quite capture it.
It's partially classist, I think, certainly. Yeah. I mean, you can find the most stereotypical rednecks in the world, but my God, are there stereotypical liberals who are terrified of everywhere that isn't New York or San Francisco and LA. I mean, they're out there too, and they're bad enough. You don't, I don't know.
Right.
It's just a lack of imagination and empathy, and just, the people who don't want to know anybody who doesn't agree with them on every single thing. And this idea that people will never change their minds on anything. And I hate to source you, but damn it, you converted Dave Barry to libertarianism. It happens. People do change. I probably
should have retired there and gone out on the high note.
But people change.
That was about 1975 or 6 or 7. So it was a lot I wouldn't have done, I guess, if I quit that. But how do you top that? He doesn't do his weekly column anymore, so he won't be writing about this, I guess, this case. He might have something funny but interesting to say about it. Well, what's related to this that we can talk about while we're still have time?
What is related to this? I tend to go from this and Waco and Ruby Ridge to sort of the question of, I don't know, I along with other people, I get tired of some of the fringy people in the so-called libertarian movement, like Gary North, not a fan of that guy, or any kind of, but I still have this feeling, even when these people are idiots who are afraid of Sharia law and Mexicans, I still have this little feeling like I should have their back. Not in any grand solidarity, like, I'm with you, I'll be right over to Oregon way, but just because I don't trust what the government's going to do. Sure. And if nothing else, even if they don't wise up on certain issues, that just let them be. I'd rather they go home and they not get killed in a new Waco. And maybe they relax in a few decades. I would rather have even racist, xenophobic weirdos sitting alive on their farms being humans. And I think people don't feel the same way. They would prefer, these people to just not be there instead. I don't know. I have a strange sense of solidarity.
If you feared that Mexicans were crossing the border to bring Sharia law to America, you'd be nervous too.
It's true. I would.
You would do crazy things. But it's not just, you make a joke. I make a joke about that, but Newt Gingrich and Glenn Beck, both at different times, I think during the 2012 election year, talked about how, as we speak, they'd say, right now, as we speak, somewhere in a room, Islamic fundamentalists and secular humanists are plotting a new world order. Now, can you imagine those two groups being in a room together plotting anything? Secular humanists and radical Islamic fundamentalists are plotting.
Yeah, they have a lot in common, definitely. So much to talk about.
Two people. Gingrich likes to present himself as a historian, right? He's a former college professor, wanted to be president. And yet he said that. And people like Dinesh D'Souza believe that.
Yeah.
Haven't heard from him lately, though. I don't know what he's up
to. That's good. I know that, paranoid weirdos who have no basis for their beliefs. I don't think Alex Jones is doing us any favors. Lots of people are not doing libertarianism or
I agree.
The government any favors. But I can't jump from that to, I hope they all burn, or they're so stupid that if they get themselves killed, I won't feel sorry. You got to be pretty bad for me to not feel sorry.
Yeah. No, hey, in my paranoid days, I think people like Alex Jones are really stooges for the Southern Poverty Law Center.
I
because
love
it's a way to discredit reasonable libertarians by creating this
right.
caricature, which I don't even think it's libertarian.
Much like PETA is probably funded by like the beef industry, honestly.
Yeah, I don't really believe that, but it's,
But
hey, it's as likely as some other conspiracy theories you see floating around, like,
that's very true.
The CIA killed JFK, stuff like that.
It's possible.
Just to pick one at random.
That's a new topic we'll have to get to one day.
Oh, yeah, way off in the future. Once the government opens up all the records.
I don't know if either of us will be here when they do that. I'm sorry to say.
I know.
They're really
That's
keeping
what.
us sealed
That's
for
what
a while.
You got my point.
Oh, that's the joke. I got it. Okay.
Yeah, I think there'll be more important things to talk about between now and that one.
Right. I don't care about JFK that much, just as a mild point of interest. I find the sanctifying of him by conspiracy theorists to be very entertaining. He was just about to reveal the truth or stop the Fed or start.
And he was a pacifist. He had just turned pacifist.
Right. Yeah.
He was going to make Gandhi his Secretary of State. Was Gandhi still alive? Yeah, Gandhi must have been alive.
Not
61.
Gandhi died in 47, man. He got shot by...
No, that's where he got shot. I forgot. Well, okay. Gandhi's descendants. You're right. He got murdered.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really mean when a pacifist gets murdered.
That's true. That's the state of the world sometimes, I'm sorry to say. Got 6 minutes left, and we ran out.
6 minutes. Phil, any questions from the crowd, the throng?
I feel like the only question is Obama tears? Question mark? Question mark? Question mark?
Well, he cried. Yeah, okay, this is a pet peeve of mine. This is guns, so I guess it's related to this, right? Because the guys have guns in Oregon.
Go for it.
Obama cried today. He was talking in front of a bunch of people who were victims of tragedy. Some of these shootings where either they themselves were shot and survived, or their children or loved ones were shot. So that's I don't want to make light of that.
No.
They suffered a terrible thing. But Obama once again was exploiting it on behalf of these executive orders he's going to sign, which will do nothing, of course, to cut down these incidents. And he started to shed tears about. I think it was when he was talking about Sandy Hook, which of course was horrendous.
Very disturbing. Yeah.
And then CNN's going to have him on in a few days for like a town hall. So it's going to be Anderson Cooper and Obama, and then an audience. Now, what kind of propaganda is that? I mean, if you have an honest debate over whether these measures could do anything, that'd be fine. But this is just. CNN getting behind Obama, right?
Right. That's not news at all to just have, just letting politicians talk. I've never understood, unchallenged, I've never understood why that's supposed to count as news, Why
doesn't the president ever participate in a debate? CNN or somebody ought to say, okay, listen, you want to be on, Obama? We'll have you on, but we're going to find somebody who really knows the gun issue very well.
Right.
And criminology and all that stuff. And one of the two of you have a talk about it on the air. Of course, he won't do it. That's demeaning, right? The president. Demeaning. The president can't do such a thing. Right. But why are they just going to turn this over to him with a bunch of sympathetic people in the audience? Okay, maybe they'll have a token person who will say, are you sure this is going to work, Mr. President? And of course, he'll get the last word and explain why what he wants are perfectly common sense measures. But it means more and more intrusions of the privacy of people who are quote mentally ill, which could mean anything. Seeing a psychiatrist because you have you can't sleep or you have anxiety. Now psychiatrists will be sharing information in order to keep such people from being able to buy a firearm and stuff like that. But see, the conservatives have sold out because they want to turn attention away from guns, so they're turning it to so-called mental illness. So they're joining in on that, and that's terrible. That's going to be a violation of people's privacy who have never done anything, never will do anything, and are caught in this, this vagueness of mental illness. And here I am thinking of the great Thomas Sass, the most underrated libertarian who ever lived, who people ought to read.
Meaning to read more of his stuff.
Actually. The late great. And he shouldn't be forgotten just because he's
No.
he's been dead a few years. We got to keep his thought alive. He still has very important things to say, especially when it comes to the therapeutic state, as he called it, which is where the government is out for our health, our mental health as well as our physical health, and is only acting for our welfare.
Of course,
because, and anybody who's wearing a white coat, of course, is simply acting for our own good. So we should not be suspicious or concerned. Just do what they say.
Yeah. Yeah, for a couple of years ago, I remember there was a particularly, I know it's redundant to say awful Ann Coulter piece, but that seemed to be a conservative refrain for a while, and maybe they're going to pick it back up. It's a great distraction away from guns. Coulter was literally saying the ACLU is at fault for, various shootings because they helped make it harder to involuntarily commit people. Because the government, small government's good, but the government has pre-crime sensibilities. Not about, people with guns, but anyone acting slightly irrationally or strangely should just be locked up indefinitely for their own safety. That sounds like small government conservatism to me.
Right, because it's gonna mean trouble for anybody who's quirky, eccentric. It's always easy after the fact. After someone does a horrible thing with a gun, it's always to say, "Oh, why didn't we should have spotted it?"
Or we should have spotted it because someone had a felony or not even felony misdemeanor weed charge. We should have known he was going to go shoot up a South Carolina church. I mean,
right. So if you take that seriously, you're going to round up a whole bunch of people who would have never committed any kind of violence, and you're going to miss a bunch of people who will commit violence, because that's just how it goes. There are no markers, biological or behavioral, and some people in the mental health field are a little bit nervous about this strong association that's being made, right, between so-called mental illness and violence. I think the statistics actually go way the other way, that people who are branded, I don't want to acknowledge it as a diagnosis, who are branded mentally ill actually tend to be less violent. And on the other hand, psychiatrists are very poor at predicting who among their patients will be violent. And so the idea that this is somehow going to lead to less violence is ridiculous. But a lot of people are going to have their rights and their privacy violated.
People are convinced that pre-crime is possible. If you just have the right mixture, you can predict who's going to snap and who's going to do something terrible. Right. If we just focus on the right thing, if it's guns or mental illness or just being a Republican, anything, we'll be able to predict it if we just do it just right. And that's just not. They're obsessed with this because they can't handle the fact that some things are not predictable and maybe unstoppable.
Right, and everybody should go out and watch again Minority Report, the Tom Cruise movie based on the Philip Dick science fiction story. But instead of the psychics who are doing the pre-crime, who are saying who's going to commit crime, so the cops can go get them before they do it, it just substitutes psychiatrists instead of psychics, because that seems to be where we're headed, and nobody wants to talk about the dangers of that. No. That's like, you're not allowed to raise that.
I'm still fascinated by when I think back on the father of the little girl who got shot in Tucson in the shooting that injured Gabby Giffords.
Yeah.
And 2 days after, his little girl got killed by a guy who seemed, more sort of illogical and unhinged than some of those people turn out being. And you'd forgive this guy almost anything because he was just in the midst of his grief. And, you'd be like, I get it. I get how upset you are. This just happened. And this guy says, this is the price of a free society, sort of saying that this is an unpredictable act. And I just can't believe that someone in that position made that argument when so many other people don't. And I kind of wonder what happened to that guy and whether he kept thinking along those lines or not. I don't know.
Yeah, he didn't get on CNN too often.
Yeah.
I'd forgotten about that guy, but yeah, you're right. We are a bit past the hour, so I guess we need to wrap up. You have any commercials? I wasn't given any things to plug.
Oh, yeah. You know what, I'm giving them, sometimes I forget, but at least I have the excuse that I wasn't sent anything to plug this time. I thought there was an SFL thing tonight, but I could be making that up.
That I don't know.
I got nothing.
Well, if anybody wants to know, just you're already connected, so check it out.
Right.
In case there's anything going on.
Even if you watch this later, Liberty.me is a fine website full of many fine podcasts and pieces of writing.
Exactly.
I recommend it.
So watch for Lucy's writings at antiwar.com and Vice, still Vice?
Or
where?
Really, but every now and again I show up in other places.
And I'm at Free Association. Everything originates there, but you can also find it at c4ss.org, Reason, Media with Conscience, Liberty.me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my latest one,
if you're confused.
So my latest one is at my site now, which is sheldonrichmond.com. You can get there. That's a shortcut. But it'll be those other places during as the week wears on. Surely at liberty.me tomorrow, I'm sure, and then the other places. So
all right.
Check it out. Thank you, everybody. Come back in 2 weeks. We'll have another exciting topic.
Thanks, audience, and thanks, Sheldon. It was real as always. Good ranting and tangents, but they all kind of worked, I think.
Yes. See you soon.
All right,
bye-bye.
Bye.